Many Jews and Christians alike are confused about the history and timing of the split between Judaism and Christianity. They may refer to Jesus and his disciples as Christians when in fact they were Jews. Neither they nor their Jewish opponents nor the Romans saw them as anything other than Jews. The term Christian appears only 3 times in the New Testament and was first used in approximately 44 CE, about 14 years after the crucifixion. The parting of the ways was not a discrete one-time event. Rather, the late Professor Daniel Harrington S.J. of Boston University wrote that it happened at different times in different places. Some scholars place it as early as the first few years after Jesus' death, while others place it as late as 400 CE. Why did Christianity arise and separate from Judaism? At the time of Jesus, Jews in the land of Israel lived under Roman occupation. The Jewish community was divided about what to do. Some counseled accommodation, some counseled armed resistance, and some expected God to send a Messiah to rescue Israel and defeat the Romans. The group around Jesus believed him to be the Messiah, but there were other groups who believed in other messianic figures at roughly the same time. Some of these messianic figures meant to fight the Romans. Others expected God to somehow transform the situation. It's not possible to know for sure what Jesus and his followers thought his mission was, because all of the Gospels were written decades after Jesus' crucifixion, and they do not agree amongst themselves. After Jesus' death, many of his followers still believed in him and expected him to return from the dead. New people joined the Jesus movement, including some Gentiles. One of the Jews who joined sometime after Jesus' death was Saul of Tarsus, who became known as Paul. With Gentiles joining the community, a split began to develop. Did Gentiles who wished to join the Jesus-following community need to become Jewish, including circumcision, keeping kosher, and observing the Sabbath? Peter, who was one of Jesus' followers during his lifetime, and James, Jesus' brother, believed they did. Paul said they did not. It's important to remember that around the time Christianity originated, there were lots of people all over the Roman Empire known as God-fearers. There was much about Judaism they admired, monotheism and a sense of ethics, but they were unwilling to become fully Jewish. The things that kept them from converting were Shabbat, keeping kosher, and especially the need to become circumcised. Paul wrote some very strong things against his fellow Jesus followers who wanted their Gentile associates to adopt more Jewish practices. As his view became normative, he was increasingly understood as having said that Judaism had been superseded, that there was no value in Judaism or Jewish observance, and that only through belief in Jesus could one be saved. This reading of Paul led to dire consequences for Jews as Christianity came to dominate the Roman Empire and later many other countries. Jews were targeted for conversion, persecution, and even death because of their religion and because of the false idea that they had killed Jesus. It was only after the Holocaust that both Christian and Jewish scholars began to re-examine Paul's writings and the history of the development of Christianity. They discovered, among other things, that Paul was not the only voice from this period, and that other groups of Christians continued to observe various Jewish practices and even worship in synagogues for decades, if not centuries, later. In at least one case around the year 90 CE, Jewish leaders had thrown Jewish Christians out of the synagogue, and scholars believe that many of the harshest things said about Jews in the New Testament, such as the charge that Jews killed Jesus, come on the background of this traumatic split. Many scholars now believe that the traditional understanding of what Paul was saying is incorrect. According to this new understanding, Paul, who always viewed himself as a Jew, was not saying that Judaism was worthless or superseded. It continued to be valid for Jews. But, he said, before Jesus, the only way to get to know God was to become a Jew, which most Gentiles would not or could not do. Through Jesus, Paul believed, there was now another way for Gentiles to know and serve God, one that did not require circumcision, Shabbat, and Kashrut. Gentiles who accepted Jesus were now fully in relationship with God and did not need to observe these Jewish practices. This new view of Paul is helpful in resetting the relationship between Judaism and Christianity. While Jews and Christians will continue to disagree over certain theological issues, such as the possibility of God being incarnated in human flesh, the two religious communities need no longer see each other as rivals, enemies, or opposites. They can be seen as two parallel paths to the one God.